Okay, amazing. All right, so welcome everyone. Thanks for being here. Like I said, my name is Hannah, and I'm joined with Diane, both from SE CASC. And we're going to talk today a little bit about our project, specifically how we're using AI to accelerate climate adaptation science synthesis in tandem with our conversations with practitioners and their needs with climate science data. So let me start with a big picture of what we're trying to accomplish at Southeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. Our overall goal with this project is to synthesize climate adaptation science specifically for the Southeast and US Caribbean regions, and critically to bridge research practice gaps. So doing this effectively requires several key ingredients. First, we need diverse knowledge systems. While our work is initially beginning with peer-reviewed literature, climate adaptation isn't just limited to these sources. It's also about integrating traditional ecological knowledge, local expertise, and on-the-ground observations. Second, it requires collaborative partnerships. So we can't do this work in isolation. Many of you in the Zoom represent partnerships that make this work possible and relevant. Third, and a really crucial part, is genuine research practice connection. Not just communicating research findings, but actually listening to what practitioners need and designing our work around those needs. For this particular project, we're focusing on wildlife-related climate adaptation, and our outputs will be specifically designed to be practical, with tools and visualizations that you can actually use in decision-making processes. So before we dive into the methods and the AI components, I wanted to share about what we're hearing directly from practitioners, because that's what's driving the entire approach of this project. So at the CCAS Symposium in September, Diane and I had the chance to host a World Cafe table where we held discussions with natural resource managers, conservation practitioners, and agency staff, amongst others. So what we heard was pretty clear and consistent across these different groups. So to read the first quote here, we heard that climate science is there, but distilling down to management actions, information to action is the missing link, not necessarily communication. So what this is telling us is that the science exists and the communication channels exist, but there's still this existing gap. It's not about whether the research is being published or even communicated. It's more about whether it's in a form that actually supports decisions and actions. This second quote says, many missing disadvantaged populations, more info from ground level people. What are you seeing? What do you want? And this speaks to the need for inclusivity and diverse voices in both the science that we're synthesizing, as well as the process itself. And finally, we heard people love to do actions that have already been done and have been successful, including the time. So practitioners want proven approaches. They want to know what worked, where, how long did it take, and what did it cost. So the key pattern we're seeing across all the conversations we've been having so far is this shift from what's happening with climate change to what do we actually do about it. So practitioners are ready to act. They just need this actionable intelligence to do so. So this brings us to the core problem that we're trying to solve. There's this critical information gap with things like scale mismatch, translation gap from data to action, as well as missing solutions showing both what works and what doesn't work. So the research exists with thousands of peer-reviewed studies on climate adaptation strategies, but it's not in a form that practitioners can use. So what does this mean? It means that research findings are scattered across hundreds of journals and databases. Recommendations might be buried in technical language and lengthy articles, and there's not really an easy way to find what works for your specific context, your specific ecosystem, or any other specific constraints. And by the time these systematic reviews are published, they might be several years out of date. And this isn't a criticism of researchers or practitioners, it's just a structural challenge in how science gets produced, published, and translated into practice. So this is what we're trying to address, both with our synthesis as well as the potential AI integration that we're working on. And we're not starting this research from scratch, so we're actually building directly on this excellent prior work by Olivia Ledee and her colleagues. In 2021, they published what they called the adaptation menu, which is a comprehensive synthesis of climate adaptation research and tools specifically for wildlife management. They reviewed all the literature from 2000 through 2017, and the findings were pretty substantial, with about 509 relevant publications, from which they extracted about 2,300 specific recommendations for climate adaptation. So thinking about that for a moment, it's an average of about 4 to 5 actionable recommendations per paper, which tells you how rich this literature is once you're able to boil it down to those relevant articles. Across these articles, they identified common concepts and recommendations that kept appearing throughout the research related to things like protected areas, invasive species management, and ecosystem services. But they also identified some areas where there was less specific recommendations related to local scale management, as well as only about 1% of recommendations focusing on things like reproduction, survival, disease, and human-wildlife conflict. So both these common concepts and the recommendations that are lacking are building blocks that practitioners can work with. But here's the thing, that review only went through 2017, now being early 2026, and knowing that climate science moves fast, with new strategies being tested, new evidence emerging, and new challenges becoming apparent, it's important to update and expand on the foundation of Olivia Liddy and her colleagues. So here's our three-pronged approach for this process. So the first thing we're doing is a direct replication of the Liddy study, but covering the period from 2017 through July 1st, 2025, when our project started. So this gives us continuity so we can see how the field has evolved and added to that foundation of the 2,300 recommendations we saw from Olivia Liddy. And then we want to expand this literature synthesis to expand the scope. So that original study only focused on certain areas of wildlife adaptation, initially excluding plants and aquatic systems. So we're hoping to add those back in, as well as extending the time frame of searching additional databases and things like that to give us a more comprehensive picture of the adaptation strategies available. But this third part is also crucial. So we're not just doing this literature review in isolation. We're also simultaneously conducting qualitative interviews with practitioners to ask things like, what data do you actually need? What are the barriers you face in accessing and using climate adaptation research? What would make information more useful in your decision making? So this parallel process means we can design our synthesis tools based on real user needs and not just assume what practitioners might want from the result of this process. So to show where we're currently at, we're at that first stage of literature review replication. And we started with the same keyword search that Liddy and her colleagues used and used the same database with EBSCOhost. So this initial search identified approximately 1,600 papers that are potentially related to climate adaptation for wildlife. So again, for context, that's 1,600 papers published between 2017 and mid-2025, which just gives you a sense of how active the field's become and continues to be. And so because we couldn't read all 1,600 papers in detail, we had an initial screening stage where we went through and removed the ones that were automatically out of the process. So we knew, because we're replicating the process, that we weren't including plants or aquatic systems, as well as those that didn't have a direct focus. So from reading the abstracts, we were able to pull those out, and we're left with about 750 papers that moved on to that full human coding process. So that's the more labor-intensive part, just because we are reading the papers in their entirety, identifying things like habitat, species, and all of the specific management recommendations. So separating those that give specific advice related to climate adaptation to those that don't have specific recommendations. So we're on about month 3 or 4 of this process, and we're about halfway through, which gives you an idea of the amount of effort and time that goes into this process. So as we work through this, it's sort of setting the stage for where AI could potentially make a big difference in terms of the timing and the effort that's needed to get this good information, which is where I'm going to turn the reins over to Diane.
Thank you, Hannah. Do you want to just click through or should I share? You'll click through. Perfect. I'm just going to let Hannah know when to click through. So once again, hi, I'm Diane, if you don't remember from a little bit earlier, but I want to talk about now our AI approach. So here's the opportunity that we're exploring. And Hannah went over this or kind of discussed some of this. So there might be a little repetition, but just hang with me. But we know that management decisions need the current scientific evidence. And we know that traditional literature reviews can take anywhere from 6 to 12 months. Hannah mentioned we're at our 3rd or 4th month, and we're still in the thick of it. For rapidly changing topics like climate adaptation, that delay means practitioners may be working without the most recent information. So what we're exploring is whether AI can accelerate the screening process without compromising scientific rigor. And that's why we have that question mark in this title. And that question mark is intentional. We're not claiming we've solved it yet or we've solved this. We are testing an approach, though, and validating it carefully. Next slide. So the question, why AI? On the challenge side, we started with just under 1,600 articles to review. And traditional screening of that volume would take months. And by the time publishing, the evidence can be 3 or more years old. We see that in current literature reviews that are happening. So the solution we're testing, studies show that some previous studies show that AI-assisted screening can cut that time by 50 to 80% while maintaining accuracy comparable to human reviewers. But the key principle here is that AI assists and humans make the final decisions. So what we are doing thus allows us to build on the work of Olivia Ledee and colleagues while also updating the review process to increase efficiency with tools that were not available for Olivia Ledee and her colleagues 10 years ago. Nailed it, Hannah. So with that, we landed on a 3-step process. Step 1, AI filters out obviously irrelevant papers using abstracts. For us, Hannah went through that, being that we were replicating, so we removed aquatic system and plants. So this would be, though, for any literature review, this would be for things that are clearly wrong topic, wrong species, wrong geography. And now, unless you have a very specific filter requirement, abstracts typically give you enough to make this first cut. So at this first step, we also suggest a more conservative approach here. So when in doubt, training or prompting AI to include rather than exclude. For step 2, for the remaining papers, AI does detailed screenings on full manuscripts. So this identifies which papers so for our literature review, this would identify papers that actually contain the management recommendations we're looking for versus purely research focused. So for a different literature review, the prompt would include guidance on what is being looked for specifically. For us, it would flag papers with actionable guidance for human review. And since the full manuscripts are longer, this is something that would be processed in groups or batches more to account for the larger length of those manuscripts. Now, step 3 is critical. That's human verification. Experts review all the flagged papers, verify relevance, extract the details, and make final determinations. So at the end of the day, no papers get included without a human saying yes. Next slide. So this brings us to discussing how our lit review, or how we are hoping our lit review, it will standardize or help us standardize the AI screening process. So why do we need this step? So to take a step back, in the previous slide discussing the literature review itself, those would be done with, let's say, a prompt, right? Where you could describe what you are looking for, give it to AI, and then they can review. So that's just writing a prompt. Whereas what this next step is critical for is when we first started testing AI screening with just those prompts, or with just those prompts and then with a small batch of human grounded examples, which I'll explain, we started seeing inconsistent results. One session would include a certain set of articles based on our prompt, and another session would maybe include 3 times as many. So providing the same general criteria to AI was giving us dramatically different outputs, which does not meet the scientific rigor we're hoping to, that we discussed. So it taught us that getting good results from AI is not just about writing a detailed prompt and letting it run. And when I say prompt, that is just when you're typing into, what you type into your AI of choice. What we discovered is it's really an iterative process where you not only refine your criteria and your prompts, but you also test it against human or known examples and build in checkpoints. So for example, we would what we did was provide an Excel with Hannah and I would go through and look at which ones we would, as humans, include or exclude. And then we use that as training. So that's what this slide is about, using human literature review to standardize the AI screening. We need to figure out how many human reviewed examples does the AI need to perform well, what prompts work best, and how do we measure that success? So this approach is to take the sample of papers that humans have already screened, use those as training examples for AI, then compare those AI decisions to the human decisions on separate validation set. And through this iteration, we find also what specific screening criteria and prompts work best. So go to the next slide. So what three things do we need to make this work? So first, training with examples. And this one is critical. It's what I was kind of not so elegantly just describing, but studies show when given just a prompt, AI accuracy was around 30%. When provided human reviewed examples, that accuracy jumped up to 93. So then we need second, a rigorous validation. So in that pilot phase, checking every single AI decision for that first 50 to 100 papers. So then that lets you catch those problems early and refine the criteria. And then you'll want to continue validation periodically throughout the review, spot checks, which I think is traditional as well. And then finally, that third, that human control. Every paper that makes it into the final review must be reviewed by the human expert. That ensures that AI is a tool, is a filter, and not a final decision maker. Go to the next slide. Yeah. So what does this actually mean in practice? By combining AI efficiency with human expertise, we can and want to deliver current actionable climate adaptation evidence to practitioners faster. We want to be able to keep pace with how quickly science is evolving. But with all that being said, faster literature synthesis is only valuable if it answers the right questions. So that's why we're running these practitioner interviews alongside this work. So we're not just synthesizing information faster, but we're synthesizing what is actually needed by practitioners. So that brings us to our pitch. Thank you for listening. And this is where we come in with the fact that we are actively conducting interviews with practitioners to make sure we are building what serves needs. So if you're willing to share your perspective on what climate adaptation information would be most useful for you, how you currently access that research or that information, what barriers you face trying to get information or trying to find guidance, we really would love to talk with you on that. So we have our emails to reach out to us, but even easier, you can drop the email in that Q&A and we'll reach out to you directly. But with that, yes, that is our presentation. Thank you so much for listening.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Diane. Hannah, I'm going to take a moment here. There's two questions in the chat. I'll just ask them real quick. Folks, if you continue to have questions, keep putting them in the chat, but we will move on to Sierra here in a second. One of the questions came in, Hannah, while you were speaking about your section, is from Rob here. He's asking about, did you consider also using the same time frame as the initial study? And then understanding whether initial results can be replicated seems important. By replicating over the same time frame, you could see whether your study came up with similar results and then compare with more recent studies, et cetera. Is that part of your consideration here?
At this stage, we've talked about it before, like doing a replication, especially both ourselves and with AI to see if it would match human results that were done at that stage. Right now, it's more of what can we fit into the hours we have in the day. So right now, it's just the replication. But it's a really interesting thought to see if both we can replicate the results that have already been published and potentially use that to see how the AI shapes up with a different data set and not the one that we're creating.
If you don't mind, I think
Absolutely.
one of the things we played with that did show us how we do need to do a full data set and like go work backwards training was that we did actually do a poll. We followed the methods exactly from the paper, pulled the papers, got a number that like within, I think, 10% matched their initial pull from that. Now, we don't know if the papers were the matches, right? We just were going by numbers. And then we gave a prompt to try to narrow down, right, to remove, I think, like the plants and and aquatic, and that was where we got our random numbers, and that's what told us that we need to have like a big like that, and that was playing around. That wasn't to be like any, it was just kind of playing around with, but we did find that the numbers changed dramatically in what it was included when we used this like really rough put together with limited human training examples. So I think kind of what you're talking about, that would be, that's something else we'd love to do. That's something we could also say, like if people like we ourselves, or if there's literature reviews fully done with great methods like uh along the way, like we could put that into AI now and test it against humans, right? We just happen to be starting with our data set to be able to do it all human and go backwards.
Awesome. Thanks, Diane. Thanks, Hannah. Another question that's very popular in the chat is, which AI programs are you using?
So this is just personal preference, but I use Claude, Claude, and then I that's what I kind of brought onto the team, and our team uses Claude. I joke that I once saw a list and Claude happens to be the chattier of the chat of the AIs. Like it just talks more with like more like human, I guess, like talking with you. So not surprising that's the one I liked. But I like Claude. Um,
Also, we have talked in this process of testing what works best. We've talked about applying that to different platforms as well as a
yeah.
potential add-on to the methods. So right now it's Claude, but we're also willing and hopeful to test some other platforms as well.
Yeah,
Awesome.
we'd love to make this like a methods thing where people could take their stuff and just run it through, and we could all share results on like how that works with the AI, because I think it's a useful tool that, but we're all trying to figure out how to navigate it.
Yeah. Well, those tools also are quickly adapting on their own right as well. It's like yeah, awesome.
Right.
Well, Diane, Hannah, you both have access to this Q&A that is continuing to blow up with some questions. You're able to type answers in there too, so
Cool.
feel
Awesome.
free to tag team that. And if
Gotcha.
there's anything unanswered, we can come back to y'all. But I want to make sure that Sierra gets enough time to also talk and also
Yeah.
answer some questions. So I'll turn it over at this point with Sierra, but if you still have questions, feel free to use that Q&A. Diane and Hannah are looking at it as well. So Sierra, shifting gears. Go ahead, please, if you'll share your screen, introduce yourself, and then give us a little bit of a chat about your work.
One sec. Things are looking funky. You know how it
We can
goes.
see it. It looks good on this end.
Okay, well, it looks weird to me is the issue. So one moment. Let's see. Okay, there, better.
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. Today I'm going to be talking about some work that I've been doing for the past few months with SE CASC on assessing plant species responses across the Southeast to climatic anomalies. Oh, I was supposed to introduce myself. My name's Sierra Perez. I'm a postdoc with SE CASC. I joined SE CASC and NC State in June or July this year or this past year, and I had just completed my PhD at Indiana University in evolution, ecology, and behavior. Okay, so jumping in with some background information, climate change is increasing both the frequency and intensity of climatic extremes. So here we see in this conceptual figure an ecosystem function, for example, primary productivity. And this black line here, it's its long-term baseline conditions. And there's some natural variability. It bounces around. Some years, maybe it's more productive than other years. And this natural variability interacts with climate change to exacerbate stress and ecological extremes. So here we see that climate change increases, for example, primary productivity reductions. But not only are individual climatic factors increasing in their frequency and severity, but we're also seeing an increased probability of the co-occurrence of climatic drivers. So either sequentially or simultaneously. And these factors may not even be extreme themselves because their interaction can cause impacts that exceed the sum of their individual impacts. So a recent example of that in this region were the impacts of Hurricane Helene. So in the days preceding Hurricane Helene, the Southern Appalachians received significant rainfall inputs. which when Hurricane Helene ultimately made landfall in the region, compounded the rainfall impacts from Helene, and by September 28th, Asheville looked like this. So in the scientific literature, extreme and compounding climatic events have received increased attention in recent years, both in the 5th National Climate Assessment as well as in the 6th IPCC report. But this research so far, and understandably, has primarily focused on the impacts to human systems, so human health, economic impacts, infrastructure impacts, as well as some consideration of like ecosystem level processes. But the implications for ecological populations and communities so far are relatively underappreciated. And there are a few challenges behind this. First, disciplinary divisions. So research on compound climatic risks is often centered around in this climate risk assessment world, which is very human focused. And there's parallel lines of inquiry in ecological and biological realms, so disturbance ecology and multiple stressor research. But these research areas don't necessarily strictly focus on interacting climatic factors. So integrating perspectives from these disparate but related disciplines will help further this work. And then we also often lack baseline data to effectively evaluate impacts and recovery. So we must rely on opportunistic studies where long-term data monitoring just happens to coincide with a climatic event. So for example, in Northeast Puerto Rico, where the Luquillo Experimental Forest is, El Yunque National Forest, just happened to coincide with the path of Hurricane Maria. So researchers could evaluate hurricane impacts relative to long-term baseline conditions, as well as post-hurricane recovery. We can also use experimental studies, but obviously to some degree, these studies lack a degree of biological realism. So getting into the question motivating this work, we wanted to ask how plant species across the Southeast are responding to interacting climatic anomalies. And this question is relevant to a range of organisms. So why plants in particular? Well, plants underlie ecosystem functioning and human-derived ecosystem services in terrestrial ecosystems. So understanding how this foundational layer for ecosystem health and biodiversity maintenance is responding to climatic extremes and their interaction is really important for predicting responses more broadly. From a conservation perspective, the Southeast is a hotspot for floristic diversity. So understanding what species are maybe more or less sensitive can give predictive insights into species potentially of conservation concern. So what factors in particular are plants in this region responding to? So unlike many regions in the US, the Southeast is getting wetter. So in recent decades and into the future, we're expected to see increased precipitation overall, but also that this precipitation will be increased in its intensity. So fewer events, but more intense. And then simultaneously, this region is not only getting wetter, but also hotter. So we're seeing increased evaporative demand. So plants must acclimate to this kind of continuum of wetter, but more evaporation. So to address the issues of often lacking baseline data to evaluate how plants and other organisms are responding to climatic extremes, we leverage long-term data sets throughout the SE CASC region and into Virginia. So these were 5+ year records of species level plant performance from the past 2 decades. And the records we found were primarily from NEON, or the National Ecological Observatory Network, and the National Estuarine Research Reserve. And in total, we found 13 sites that with data that met our criteria. Our measure of plant performance was percent cover, which for those of you who are not familiar with this measure, It's calculated by laying out a quadrat of a known size, typically a meter square quadrat, and evaluating what percent of area does a specific species cumulatively occupy. And in total, the area is 100%, so we can't exceed 100% occupation. Ooh, going back. And I should also say that, this is a rough measure of plant performance or plant fitness, but over time, it's a good measure of how plants are responding to their environment and their conditions. Okay, in total, these data capture 250 species, the majority of which are native to the region, and 3 of these species are of conservation concern. And I want to highlight also the breadth of charismatic and characteristic ecosystems that these data capture. So sites in the southern Appalachians, forested sites along the southern coastal plain, scrub sites down into Florida, and salt marshes along the coast. Okay, to identify our climatic anomalies, we use 2 approaches. So for precipitation, we use the Standardized Precipitation Evapotranspiration Index, or SPEI, which essentially evaluates water balance at a site using or accounting for precipitation inputs as well as precipitation or water outputs via evapotranspiration. So it evaluates the baseline at a site through a set period of time, and then evaluates at a given time period, how do conditions deviate from this long-term normal. So above 1 SPEI is considered wetter than normal, and then below -1 is considered drier than normal. We used a similar approach for identifying temperature anomalies, here using maximum temperature because we felt that relative to, say, average temperature or minimum temperature, it would be more informative of physiological stress and therefore performance impacts on plants. Okay, so to get into some preliminary results, I first wanted to orient you to this plot. On the x-axis here, we have SPEI. Again, above 1 is considered wetter than normal. Below -1 is considered drier than normal. And we have 3 different categories for our temperature anomaly. So cooler than average maximum temperature, average or hotter than average. And again, our response variable is percent cover. And for the majority of species we evaluated, we did not find predictable responses to interacting precipitation and temperature anomalies. That could just mean that species are not sensitive to these factors, or they respond in very variable ways, so we can't predict it. However, for the subset of species that did have a significant response to the interaction of temperature and precipitation anomalies, we found that for many of them, performance increased under these cool, dry conditions and hot, wet conditions, although there are other species that show kind of the opposite pattern. So there is some variability in responses. For species that did not have an interaction between these 2 factors, we evaluated if they responded to one or both of them independently. And we found that for many they did, and climate anomalies may alter performance, but not necessarily in consistent ways. So for example, here for SPEI, some species are actually perform better under drier conditions, whereas many prefer wetter conditions. And likewise for this temperature anomaly metric. So where do we go from here? Next, we would like to dig into what factors are potentially explaining species responses to these climatic anomalies. Some preliminary results suggest that phylogenetic relationships may partly drive these responses. So digging into that, as well as potentially the role of plant functional traits. And then we would like to also kind of scale this up to the plant community level to consider what are the implications for diversity metrics like species richness or evenness. And my email is there, so feel free to reach out, and I'm happy to take any questions.